Colchester, 1945. The truck rolled to a stop at the edge of town square, under skies heavy with spring clouds, the air thick with smells that made empty stomachs clench with sudden hunger. Through canvas flaps, German women strained to see what surrounded them, faces pressed forward despite exhaustion. They had been told what to expect from British civilians: hostility at best, violence at worst, people who would spit on German prisoners, who would scream hatred, who would take revenge for years of bombing and suffering. What they saw instead stopped their breathing. Market stalls stretched across the square in neat rows, vendors calling out prices, civilians moving between displays of food, actual food, vegetables and bread and meat, more food than these women had seen in years. And no one was screaming, no one was attacking. People were just shopping. For a moment, the only sound was the truck engine ticking as it cooled. Everything they had been taught about British hatred for Germans, about civilian anger toward prisoners, about revenge that would surely come, was about to collide with something impossible. Normal life continuing as if they weren't enemies at all. If you've made it this far, you're exactly the kind of person who keeps history alive. So do me one favor. Tap like so this story isn't buried, show support by subscribing so you don't miss the next chapter, and share this video so more people discover the truth history tried to hide. The journey had begun 7 weeks earlier on a grey morning outside Hanover. Rosa Lindemann stood among 195 women in a converted factory building, her Wehrmacht auxiliary uniform bearing the communications insignia she'd worn while operating radio equipment for 3 years across occupied France. She was 27, a signals specialist who had transmitted orders that sent men to their deaths, though she'd tried never to think about that part. Around her, nurses from field hospitals, clerks from supply depots, factory supervisors who'd managed production of military equipment, even a pharmacist from Munich who'd been conscripted to work in military medical supply, all captured as British forces swept through northern Germany. They had expected summary execution or worse. The propaganda had been specific. British civilians hated Germans with murderous intensity. Prisoners would face mob violence, would be paraded through streets for public humiliation, would suffer revenge for Luftwaffe bombing campaigns. Instead, they received medical examinations, delousing treatments, and grey woolen dresses stamped with POW in red letters. The marking felt like targets painted on their backs. The Channel crossing was brutal beyond imagining. Seasickness that emptied stomachs already nearly empty, cold that penetrated to bone marrow, darkness broken only by occasional guard patrols with torches. Women clung to each other for warmth, some praying to gods they'd stopped believing in years before, others silent with the resignation of those who'd already surrendered hope. Rosa kept a pencil and small notepad hidden in her undergarments, writing by whatever light she could steal. March 28, 1945. We sail to England now. Propaganda promised we would face civilian mobs, that British people would tear us apart for what our Luftwaffe did to their cities. I am terrified of what waits across this dark water. The English damp struck differently than German cold when they docked at Harwich. Not sharp, but penetrating, working through wool, through skin, settling into joints with patient inevitability. Grey dock met grey sky, met grey water in endless monochrome. Women stumbled down gangways on legs that had forgotten solidity, blinking in light that seemed filtered through layers of moisture and exhaustion. British soldiers waited on the dock. Not the vengeful mob promised by propaganda, but soldiers doing a job. Professional, efficient, neither kind nor cruel, just processing another batch of prisoners according to established procedures. They loaded women onto trucks with canvas covers, drove north through countryside that looked impossibly intact, villages with undamaged buildings, fields already showing spring growth, infrastructure that still functioned, none of the total destruction visible in Germany, where every city was rubble, where nothing worked anymore, where civilization itself seemed to have collapsed. "Why isn't it destroyed?" whispered Anna Fischer in German. She was 24, a nurse from Berlin, young enough to still believe the propaganda about British cities being bombed to oblivion. They said our bombers destroyed everything, but look, it's all still here. No one answered. The cognitive dissonance was too immediate, too overwhelming to process while exhausted and terrified. Camp 186 emerged from Essex countryside like a temporary city. Rows of Nissen huts arranged in military precision, wire fencing that enclosed without appearing brutal, guard towers manned by soldiers who looked bored rather than hostile. The camp commandant was a British colonel named James Hartwell, a career officer with kind eyes and a voice that carried authority without harshness. He stood at the administration building entrance as trucks delivered their human cargo, his bearing professional but not threatening. "You will be treated in accordance with Geneva Convention requirements," he said through a translator, a German Jewish woman who had fled to Britain in 1937. His voice was firm but not cruel. "You will work on local farms and in camp maintenance. You will be fed, housed and provided medical care as needed. We have arranged for work parties to visit nearby town for market shopping once monthly. You will be supervised but not restricted from interacting with civilians." The German women stood in formation, Essex wind cutting through thin dresses, trying to process these impossible words. Market shopping, interacting with civilians. This had to be the setup for something terrible. Propaganda victims led to slaughter by false promises. Colonel Hartwell dismissed them to barracks. The Nissen huts were basic but weather-tight. Metal-framed bunks, thin mattresses that were still mattresses, small coal stoves for warmth, windows with shutters that actually closed, and everywhere this strange British civility that made no sense. Guards who nodded as prisoners passed, administrative staff who processed them without contempt, a camp doctor who examined them with professional detachment rather than disgust. It was all wrong. These people should hate them, should want revenge, should express the rage that propaganda promised. Instead, they just did their jobs. Morning came at 6 o'clock. Roll call in the compound yard, sunrise turning clouds pink and gold. British guards counted women with methodical accuracy, then directed them to the mess hall. This was where the first real shock occurred. The building was long and low, windows showing steam from cooking, the smell making women dizzy with hunger. They filed in expecting starvation rations, perhaps soup made from vegetables too rotten for British use, bread made from sawdust as German bread had become. Instead, they found trays loaded with porridge made from actual oats, bread that was coarse but real, margarine, tea with milk. Real food. Warm food. More food than most had eaten in months. Rosa stared at her tray as if it might vanish or transform into something poisonous. Around her, women sat paralyzed, unable to touch what must be some kind of test or trick. One older woman, Frau Weber, began crying silently, tears cutting tracks through the dirt on her face that weeks of travel had accumulated. A British soldier serving the line noticed their hesitation. He spoke no German, but he took a piece of bread from the serving tray, took a bite himself, gestured to their plates with an expression that said, "It's safe. Just eat." The women ate carefully, each bite an act of faith that this wasn't elaborate torture. The porridge was warm and filling. The bread was dense, but genuine. The tea was hot and tasted like life returning to dead limbs. In Germany, people were eating grass and tree bark. Here, prisoners ate better than German civilians, better than they themselves had eaten for the final year of service. The guilt from this reality was immediate and crushing. Work assignments came after breakfast, some women sent to camp kitchens, others to laundry, still others to local farms. The work was genuine labour, 8-hour days with breaks for tea and lunch. Supervisors who corrected mistakes with patience rather than violence. And everywhere, this persistent British normalcy that felt more disturbing than cruelty would have been. as if German prisoners weren't enemies to be punished, but simply workers to be managed. But it was the market trips that changed everything. On their fourth week, Colonel Hartwell made an announcement during evening assembly. Spring rain had stopped, and weak sunshine broke through clouds for the first time in days. A work party of 20 women will accompany guards to Colchester Town Market tomorrow, he said through the translator. You will assist with purchasing supplies for camp kitchens. You will have supervised interaction with local merchants. You will conduct yourselves appropriately. The German women listened with growing dread. This was it. The setup. They would be paraded through town, presented to angry mobs, subjected to the public humiliation and violence that propaganda had always promised. The British had just been softening them first, making the eventual betrayal more devastating. That night, Rosa wrote in her hidden notepad, "Tomorrow we go to Town Market. The others are terrified. We all know this must be when the real punishment begins. British civilians will have their revenge. I am more afraid than I have been since capture. At least in camp we are protected. In town, among people whose cities we bombed, whose families we killed, there will be no protection. God help us." The morning came cold and clear. 20 women assembled in the compound, selected for physical fitness and language skills. Rosa was chosen because she spoke some English, learned before the war when such things were still allowed. The British Guards were the same ones who'd supervised work details for weeks. Corporal Davies, Sergeant Thompson, Private Mackenzie. Professional men doing a job, their weapons carried casually, no threat in their posture. They loaded women into a truck and drove the 3 miles to Colchester Centre. The town square appeared through morning mist like something from a painting. Medieval church spire rising above stone buildings. Market stalls arranged in traditional pattern, vendors setting up displays, and people, British civilians, dozens of them, moving through morning routines, shopping, talking, living lives that continued despite war, despite enemies, despite everything. Rosa's hands trembled as the truck stopped at the square's edge. This was where it would happen, the screaming, the violence, the revenge. Corporal Davies helped each woman down from the truck bed, his hand steady, his expression neutral. "Right then," he said in his Yorkshire accent, "we're here to purchase vegetables and meat for camp kitchens. Mrs. Henderson over there handles produce. Mr. Clark does the butchering. Both know you're coming. Both have agreed to sell to us at fair prices. You'll assist with selection and carrying. Questions?" The women stood frozen, waiting for the trap to spring. Davies gestured toward the market stalls. "Come on then, not getting any warmer standing about." They walked into the market like soldiers advancing into no man's land, every sense alert for danger. British civilians turned to look, stared. Rosa waited for the first shout, the first thrown object, the first expression of the hatred that must be building behind those stares. Instead, an elderly woman selling flowers called out, "Morning, Corporal Davies. These the German girls, then? Poor things look half-starved. Get them some proper food, will you?" Davies smiled. "That's the plan, Mrs. Patterson." The flower seller nodded, turned back to arranging her displays. That was it. No rage. No violence. Just acknowledgement and something that sounded almost like sympathy. Rosa felt reality tilting, couldn't process what she'd just witnessed. Mrs. Henderson, the produce vendor, was a woman of 50 with strong hands and a direct manner. She looked at the German women without apparent hatred, gestured to her displays of cabbages, potatoes, carrots, turnips, all fresh, all real. "Your camp wants 2 bushels of potatoes, 1 of carrots, half bushel of cabbages. You lot can help sort them. Pick out the bad ones. We don't cheat anyone, even Germans." Rosa and 3 others approached the produce stall like it might explode. Mrs. Henderson showed them how to check for rot, for damage, for quality. She worked alongside them, her hands moving quickly through vegetables, tossing aside any that didn't meet her standards. And she talked. About weather, about spring planting, about her son who was in the army somewhere in Germany, about hoping he'd come home safe. Casual conversation. As if they were assistants rather than enemies. "You speak English?" Mrs. Henderson asked Rosa directly. "Some. Little," Rosa replied carefully. "That's more than I speak German, love." "Where you from?" "Hanover." "That got bombed bad, didn't it? Shame. War's terrible for everyone." She handed Rosa a perfect cabbage. "This one's good. Put it in the basket." Rosa took the cabbage, hands shaking, unable to reconcile this casual kindness with everything she'd been taught. This woman's son was fighting in Germany. Germans were killing British soldiers. Yet here she was, treating German prisoners with basic human decency, lamenting destruction on both sides. It made no sense. At the butcher's stall, Mr. Clark was a large man with a blood-stained apron and surprisingly gentle manner. He showed the German women different cuts of meat, explained which were best for stewing, which for roasting, how to tell quality. He wrapped their purchases carefully, weighed everything precisely, charged fair prices recorded on receipts he handed to Corporal Davies. No cheating, no poison, no tricks, just commerce conducted honestly. Other civilians stopped to stare as German prisoners moved through the market. But the stares weren't uniformly hostile. Some showed curiosity, some showed pity, some showed wariness, yes, but not the murderous rage promised by propaganda. One woman, perhaps 30, approached Sergeant Thompson directly. "These the German prisoners from the camp?" she asked. "Yes. Ma'am, my brother died at El Alamein, German tank shell." Her voice was flat, factual. Thompson's posture shifted slightly, ready for whatever came next. The German women froze, terror returning. This was it. The revenge. The British woman looked at them for a long moment. "You lot look like you've been through hell yourselves. War's evil. Kills everyone's brothers." She turned to Thompson. "You feeding them properly?" "Yes, ma'am, as well as we can with rationing." "Good. Someone has to remember we're supposed to be better than this whole bloody mess." She walked away, leaving the German women stunned into silence. The market trip lasted 2 hours. 2 hours of civilians treating them not as hated enemies, but as unfortunate women caught in circumstances beyond their control. Not everyone was kind. Some vendors refused to serve them. Some civilians glared with undisguised hatred, but the dominant response was something the propaganda had never prepared them for: indifference mixed with occasional sympathy. British people were too tired, too worn by 6 years of war to maintain the constant hatred that propaganda had promised. They just wanted the war over, wanted normal life to resume, wanted to stop losing sons and brothers and fathers. The drive back to camp was silent except for truck engine noise. Women sat clutching bags of vegetables, minds trying to process what they'd experienced. Rosa finally spoke. "Why weren't they angry? Our bombers destroyed their cities. Our military killed their people. Why didn't they hate us?" Anna, the young nurse, responded quietly. "Maybe they do hate Germans. But we're not Germany. We're just people. Maybe they can see the difference." That night, Rosa wrote, "Today I went to British Town Market and no one tried to hurt me. Civilians treated us with basic decency, some even with kindness. One woman, whose brother died fighting Germans, told us war was evil, and we looked like we'd suffered too. I don't understand. Everything we were taught said British people would tear us apart, but they just didn't. What does this mean about everything else we were told?" The market trips became monthly routine. 20 women rotating through work parties, supervised by the same guards, visiting the same vendors who grew familiar with them. Mrs. Henderson learned their names, asked about their families, showed pictures of her own son when he finally came home in June. Mr. Clark taught them English words for different cuts of meat, joked about British weather, treated them like apprentice butchers learning a trade. Other vendors slowly warmed, some remaining distant, but most eventually accepting that these were just women far from home, not personally responsible for Luftwaffe raids or Wehrmacht invasions. Rosa developed a relationship with Mrs. Henderson that approached friendship, though boundaries remained clear. One market day in May, while sorting potatoes, the older woman asked, "What did they tell you about us? About British people?" Rosa hesitated, then decided honesty was safer than deception. "That you would hate us, that civilians would attack German prisoners, that we would be paraded through streets for revenge." Mrs. Henderson was quiet for a moment, hands still sorting vegetables. "Some people do hate Germans, lost too much to forgive. But most of us are just tired of war, tired of hate, tired of losing people we love. Hating you lot won't bring back anyone we lost, just makes the whole mess bigger." "But your son fought against my country." "Your country, yes. But did you personally make the decisions that started this war? Did you command armies? Did you choose to invade other countries?" She handed Rosa a perfect potato. "I'm guessing no. You were just doing what you were told, same as my son. Both of you caught in something bigger than yourselves." Rosa felt tears starting. "I transmitted orders. Communication specialist. I sent messages that got people killed. British people. Maybe even people from this town." Mrs. Henderson looked at her directly. "And that bothers you, doesn't it? The knowing. The guilt. Yes. Then you're not the enemy. The enemy is whoever made those orders necessary. You were just caught in the machinery." She went back to sorting vegetables. "Best way to honour the dead is to make sure we don't create more of them. That means treating people with decency, even enemies, even prisoners. Otherwise, what was the point of any of this?" The transformation didn't happen uniformly across the camp. Some women, like Frau Weber, clung to propaganda certainties, insisting the British kindness was elaborate manipulation, that revenge would eventually come. Others, like Anna, adapted quickly, grateful to be treated with basic human dignity, eager to reciprocate kindness where possible. Rosa fell somewhere between, grateful but guilty, accepting kindness while struggling with shame over what her service had supported. In June, something remarkable happened that crystallized the change for many women. A British civilian, an elderly man who'd lost his entire family in a V-2 rocket attack on London, came to the market while German prisoners were shopping. Someone in the crowd recognized him, knew his story, tensed waiting for confrontation. The old man approached the German women slowly, his face showing pain that had carved permanent lines. Sergeant Thompson stepped forward immediately, positioning himself between civilian and prisoners. "Sir, I must ask you to step back." The old man ignored him, looking directly at Rosa. "You're German?" "Yes, sir," she replied quietly, ready for whatever came. "My wife, my daughter, my granddaughter, all dead. German rocket. London. February." His voice was steady but hollow, emptied of everything except facts. Rosa had no words. What could she say that wouldn't be insulting? She simply stood, waiting for justice that she probably deserved. The old man was silent for a long moment. Then, "I came here to hate you, to scream at you, to make you feel some small portion of what I feel." He paused. "But looking at you, I just see another person whose life was destroyed by this war. Hating you won't bring them back, won't change anything, won't make anything better." He turned to Sergeant Thompson. "You're treating them decently?" "Yes, sir, as regulations require." "Good. Someone should." The old man walked away, leaving everyone shaken by his restraint, by his choice to reject revenge when he had every right to claim it. That evening, back at camp, women gathered in barracks talking about what they'd witnessed. The man who'd lost everything but chose dignity over revenge. The message that sent about British society, about values that persisted even through grief, about choosing humanity over hatred. "That's the difference," Anna said quietly. "We were taught that strength meant domination, that victory meant crushing enemies, that power was demonstrated through cruelty. They show strength by choosing restraint, victory by offering dignity, power by maintaining principles even when revenge would be easier. Summer brought warmer weather and increasing trust. Market trips expanded to include more women, more interactions with civilians, more exposure to normal British life continuing around them. Women learned English phrases from vendors, learned British coins and pricing, learned that commerce conducted honestly created bonds that transcended nationality. The camp's German prisoners became familiar faces in Colchester Market, no longer objects of fear or hatred, but simply people whose presence had become normal. Rosa befriended a young British woman named Sarah, who sold eggs at the market. Sarah was 25, had been engaged to a soldier killed at Normandy, had every reason to hate Germans. Instead, she treated Rosa with kindness that seemed to come from bone-deep belief that decency mattered more than nationality. One market day in August, while Rosa helped organise egg crates, Sarah spoke about her fiancé. Thomas died on the beaches. First day, German machine gun fire. She said it matter-of-factly, stating facts without apparent rage. I was angry for months, hated all Germans, wanted revenge. Rosa stopped working, didn't know how to respond. But then I realised hating you wouldn't bring him back, wouldn't change anything, would just make me bitter forever. Sarah looked at her directly. Thomas wouldn't want that. He fought for freedom, for decency, for the idea that people should treat each other with basic humanity. If I spend my life hating Germans, then what did he die for? Just more hate. That's not victory. That's just perpetuating the evil. I'm sorry for your loss, Rosa managed. I know you are. I can see it in your face. You carry guilt, don't you, for what your country did? Yes, every day. Then you're already changed, already different from whoever started this war. That's what matters. Not what you were, but what you choose to be now. In August, the war ended. Japan surrendered. And suddenly, after 6 years, all fighting everywhere stopped. At Camp 186, Colonel Hartwell called an assembly. Women stood in summer sunshine that seemed inappropriate for such a grave moment. The war is concluded, he said. Repatriation will occur over the coming year. Until departure, camp operations continue, including market trips for those interested. He paused. I want you to understand what you've experienced here in Colchester. You've seen British civilians treat you with decency, despite having every reason for hatred. You've been welcomed into commerce despite being enemies. You've received basic human respect, despite what your nation did to theirs. The women listened in complete silence. This is what civilization looks like when it chooses to remain civilized, even under stress. When people decide that maintaining their own humanity matters more than satisfying desire for revenge. When communities recognize that former enemies are still humans deserving of dignity. His voice strengthened. When you return to Germany, some won't believe you. Some will say we manipulated you, that British kindness was strategic deception. But you know the truth. You've lived it. Tell them. Tell them that British civilians whose cities were bombed, whose families died, still chose to treat German prisoners with decency. Tell them that civilization survives when people choose it daily, even when vengeance would be easier. That evening, Rosa sought out Corporal Davies, who had supervised dozens of market trips with unwavering professionalism. I need to thank you, not just for taking us to market, but for protecting us. From civilians who might have been violent, from our own fears, from the hatred we expected. Davies nodded. That's the job, isn't it? Maintaining standards even when circumstances make it difficult. Treating people decently because that's who we choose to be. When I go home, I'll tell everyone about Mrs. Henderson and her kindness. About Mr. Clark teaching us English. About Sarah, whose fiancé died fighting Germans, but who still chose friendship over hatred. about the old man who lost his family but refused revenge. I'll tell them the British remained civilized when they had every excuse not to be. That's all we ask. Remember that revenge is easy, but changes nothing. Dignity is harder, but changes everything. Repatriation began in October. Groups processed, documented, sent south to ports. Rosa's group was scheduled for November, 7 months after arrival. The final weeks felt strange, bittersweet. Women wandered Colchester Market one last time, saying goodbye to vendors who'd become familiar, receiving small gifts to remember them by. A perfect potato from Mrs. Henderson, a small English dictionary from Mr. Clark, a letter from Sarah full of hope for reconciliation. The night before departure, 20 women who'd made market trips gathered in their barracks. They talked about what they'd learned, about how British civilians had shattered propaganda expectations, about carrying these lessons back to a destroyed Germany that desperately needed them. "We thought it was a trick," Anna said. "When they first took us to market, we expected mobs, violence, revenge. Instead, we found people who were tired of war, tired of hate, tired of losing. People who chose decency because they believed civilization required it." Rosa wrote in her notepad one final time. "Tomorrow I return to Germany. I carry memories of British civilians who treated enemies with dignity, of vendors who sold honestly to German prisoners, of a man who lost everything but chose restraint over revenge, of a woman who lost her fiancé but chose friendship over hatred. These memories contradict everything propaganda taught me. They prove that humanity can survive hatred if people simply choose to be decent. I will spend the rest of my life teaching this lesson." The journey back was long. Trains, ships, arrivals in a Germany that resembled photographs of hell. Rosa returned to Hanover, now rubble, her family living in a basement. That first night by candlelight, she told them about Colchester Market, about Mrs. Henderson and Sarah and the old man, about British civilians choosing dignity when revenge would have been easier. In the years that followed, Rosa became a teacher, working with occupation authorities to rebuild German education. She taught history honestly, what Germany had done, what had been done to Germany, what British civilians had shown her about choosing civilization over barbarism. She told every class about Colchester Market, about vendors who treated enemies with basic commercial honesty, about civilians who remembered that Germans were humans too. Mrs. Henderson continued selling produce at Colchester Market for 20 more years, treating everyone with the same straightforward decency she'd shown German prisoners. When asked about those war years, she said simply, "They were just women far from home. Treating them badly wouldn't have helped anyone." Sarah married eventually, had children, taught them that nationality mattered less than character, that former enemies could become friends if people chose understanding over hatred. She kept Rosa's letters, proof that human connection could survive war's attempts to destroy it. Colonel Hartwell rose to prominence in veterans' organizations, always advocating for dignified treatment of former enemies. His philosophy was simple. Civilization is not what you do when it's easy, it's what you do when you have every excuse to abandon it. What happened at Camp 186 and Colchester Market was not widely documented. It didn't fit comfortable narratives about punishment and justice, but it was real. German prisoners taken to British markets, supervised but not isolated, allowed to witness normal civilian life, treated with basic decency by people who had every reason for hatred. Those encounters transformed understanding more effectively than any forced program could have. Historians later noted that German POWs who experienced British civilian kindness returned home with fundamentally altered perspectives. They had seen enemies choose dignity over revenge, civilization over barbarism, humanity over hatred. These experiences didn't create instant pacifists, but planted seeds that grew into post-war Germany's rejection of militarism, its embrace of democratic values, its commitment to European reconciliation. The market where Rosa shopped still operates in Colchester today. The stalls have changed, the vendors are different, but commerce continues as it has for centuries. No marker indicates that German prisoners once shopped here, once experienced British civilians choosing kindness over revenge. But the impact ripples forward. Every lesson Rosa taught about human decency. Every friendship Sarah built across national lines. Every policy Hartwell influenced toward dignified treatment of former enemies. The German women who thought British market visits were tricks expected violence, hatred, revenge for bombers and invasions, and years of suffering. What they found instead broke their understanding so completely they had to rebuild it entirely. British civilians too tired for constant hatred. Vendors who conducted honest commerce regardless of nationality. People who'd lost everything but chose restraint over revenge. And in that gap between propaganda and reality, transformation became possible. That is the quiet victory no military campaign achieves alone. That is the transformation that happens one market transaction at a time, one act of decency at a time, one choice to treat enemies as humans deserving of dignity. In the end, it wasn't British military victory that defeated Nazi ideology in those women's hearts. It was British civilians who remained civilized when they had every excuse not to be. That is the lesson echoing across decades. That is the truth surviving when propaganda is forgotten. That is the hope remaining when everything else is destroyed. Humanity is not determined by nationality, but by daily choices. Civilization is not inherited, but maintained through consistent decency. Peace is not imposed, but built by people who choose understanding over vengeance, commerce over conflict, dignity over revenge. The women who left Camp 186 in late 1945 carried that lesson home to a destroyed nation desperately needing it. Some taught it in schools, some lived it through choices, some passed it to children and grandchildren. And somewhere in that chain, Germany became something different, not perfect, not redeemed, but better. Better because people learned that enemies are humans too. That civilization survives when people choose it. That the future doesn't require repeating the past. That sometimes transformation arrives at an ordinary market where ordinary people make extraordinary choices about remaining human.